In this module, we're going to look at mobility, or basically giving people access to their email no matter where they are and no matter which device they're accessing it from. There are two components to this module. The first is Outlook Web App Policies. They are called Outlook Web App Policies in Exchange 2016, even though Outlook Web App was renamed to Outlook on the Web. And we're also going to look at mobile device management, one of my favorite topics, super important in this modern era of everybody walking around getting their email on their mobile device. So it's something that you really should understand. But we'll start with Outlook Web App Policies. Globomantix has some goals with regards to their mobile strategy. They want to prevent Outlook on the Web users from remote wiping their own devices. They also want to secure mobile devices from the risk of loss or theft, or in other words, the risk of data loss if a mobile device becomes lost or is stolen. And they also want to allow mobile access only from approved devices. Now, these goals can be achieved with a combination of Outlook Web App Policies and mobile device management. So let's start with the Outlook Web App Policies first. What do these policies do? Well, they simply control access to features that users can get to when they're using Outlook on the web. It's important to understand that all you're doing is disabling those features or access to those features in Outlook on the web. You're not actually disabling the feature in its entirety on the mailbox itself. So let's jump into the Globomantix environment and configure an Outlook Web App Policy. To begin with, let's take a look at a user who's logged into Outlook Web App. So we've got this user, Adam Wally. He's already logged into Outlook on the web in his web browser. And we'll go into the options. And under this general section here is mobile devices. And this will display all of the mobile devices or applications that are associated with this user's mailbox. And there's two available there at the moment. And you might notice that there is a button here that looks like it's got a little eraser on it. Well, that is the button that a user could click on to remote wipe their device. Since that's a fairly destructive operation and not something we always want to allow our users to do, it's sometimes a good idea to take that option away. So on the Exchange server, logged into the Exchange Admin Center, just go to the Permissions section and look for Outlook Web App Policies. You can create additional Outlook Web App Policies if you like, if you have a need for more granular or different policy settings for different Outlook on the web users. In this case, we're just going to edit the existing policy, and then in the list of features, disable Exchange Active Sync. So that's going to prevent the user from managing their own mobile devices in Outlook on the web. After editing the policy, it needs to be applied to the mailboxes. So the default policy doesn't actually apply to any mailboxes by default. You will have to manually apply it. So find the mailbox in the list of recipients. And in the mailbox features, look for this email connectivity option. Click on View Details. And this is where you can assign the Outlook Web App Policy for that user. If the goal was to assign that Outlook Web App Policy to multiple mailboxes, it might be a little easier to do that in the Exchange Management Shell. Let's have a look at the name of the OWA Mailbox policy. So its name or identity is just the word default. So what we can do is just pipe the output from get mailbox. So selecting all of the mailboxes in the organization, piping that into set CAS mailbox, and then using the OWA mailbox policy parameter to set all of those policies or all of those mailboxes to the OWA mailbox policy named default. So that command has completed. We just get a warning because Adam Wally's mailbox had already been assigned that OWA mailbox policy. So we'll jump back to the client machine and log back into OWA and see if that policy has taken effect. And now the user cannot see the mobile device settings in their Outlook on the web option. So they can no longer use Outlook on the web to initiate a remote wipe of their mobile device. So now that we've dealt with the OMailbox policies to achieve the Globomantic's requirement of disabling users from initiating their own remote device wipes, let's have a look at what's also available in mobile device management. First of all, what is ActiveSync? ActiveSync is the protocol that allows mobile devices and applications to synchronize data with Exchange mailboxes. So that means that they'll be able to synchronize email items, calendar items, contacts, and tasks. ActiveSync connectivity is used by mobile devices and mobile applications. Usually they are connecting from outside of the network, but there's no reason that they can't also connect from inside the network, such as a corporate wireless network. Typically the devices are not domain joined, and they rely on AutoDiscover to locate the Exchange server, or you'll need to do manual configuration of the email options on the devices. All of the ActiveSync connectivity occurs over HTTPS, and it can use either direct push or just regular polling at intervals. The way that direct push technology works is that the ActiveSync client sends a ping request using the ActiveSync protocol to the Exchange server. The client then waits up to 15 minutes, sometimes as long as 30 minutes, for a response. So this is sometimes referred to as an open connection or a hanging connection. The Exchange server will respond to the client if either a change occurs in the mailbox, so for example a new email message arrives, or that time limit expires and the client needs to send a new ping and then wait again. And the way that direct push works, using that hanging connection and then the server responding immediately if there's a change in a mailbox folder, is what makes ActiveSync appear to be almost instantaneous when new mailbox items arrive. But some people don't use direct push. Some people prefer to have their device polling every 15 minutes or every hour. In that case, you won't get that full instantaneous experience of new mail arriving on your device as soon as it hits the mailbox. So let's take a look at how a mobile device will connect. In this situation, the mobile device is located on the internet, it's outside the corporate firewall. So the first thing it's going to do when it's configuring its connection to Exchange is to look up AutoDiscover. The client will look for the AutoDiscover record in DNS, and it looks based on the SMTP domain of the user's email address, for example, adamwally@globomantics.biz. That will mean the client will first look for globomantics.biz as a root domain lookup. And if it can't find an AutoDiscover at that address, it will look for autodiscover.globomantics.biz. And then again, if it can't find AutoDiscover at that address, it will try looking for an SRV record. So it will try them in that order, and as soon as it finds an AutoDiscover service at one of those addresses, it will send an AutoDiscover query. So the client will connect to that AutoDiscover service, authenticate, post the query, and in order to do that, HTTPS must be open on the firewall, and the firewall must NAT those inbound connections to Exchange, or if there's multiple Exchange servers, NAT them to the load balancer and let the load balancer distribute the traffic to the Exchange servers. That's all HTTPS traffic, which means that SSL certificates must be configured on the load balancer or on the Exchange, and they must be valid, which means they must be trusted by that mobile device. So the AutoDiscover service sends the response back to the device in an XML format, and within that XML response is the name of the AutoDiscover namespace. So now the client needs to perform another DNS lookup on that ActiveSync URL, or ActiveSync namespace that was returned in AutoDiscover. So it's going to query for mail.globomantics.biz in this example, get back an IP address from DNS, and then make the connection to that ActiveSync URL. Again, it occurs over HTTPS, so your firewall must be NATing those connections. The SSL certificates must be installed and must be valid. And the mailbox must also be enabled for ActiveSync, which they all are by default, but you can disable it on a per mailbox basis if you want to. After the mobile device has established connectivity to Exchange, the mobile device is assessed for compliance with the mobile device mailbox policies. How do these policies work? Well, they basically provide policy options for controlling mobile device features such as PIN and password policies, device encryption, cameras in smartphones, and some other settings as well. It really depends on the operating system and sometimes even the make and model of the phone or the mobile device, which policy items can be configured. There is one default policy created by Exchange Setup, but you can create multiple policies if you need to and assign them to different mailboxes that have different policy requirements. So let's go into the Globomantics environment and take a look at those mobile device mailbox policies and what they can do. In the Exchange Admin Center, you'll find mobile device policies in the mobile section, and the default policy will be the only one that will be visible unless you've configured any additional policies. Now, something interesting about this mobile device mailbox policy that is configured by default, it is actually quite a weak policy. First of all, it allows mobile devices that don't fully support these policies to synchronize anyway. And what that option is basically saying is that if the device can't comply with the policy, even important parts of the policy, such as the PIN or password requirements, well, it's just going to be allowed to connect anyway. Speaking of PIN and password requirements, the default policy doesn't actually require a PIN or a password on the device. It also doesn't require encryption. All in all, it is a pretty weak policy. One of the first things that you'll probably want to do is at least require a password. Simple passwords are better than no passwords, but 4-digit pins can be cracked. You might want to bump that up to a 6-digit pin, or perhaps even require an alphanumeric password. Device encryption is also recommended. And one of the more dangerous options is the number of sign-in failures before the device is wiped. That's not enabled by default, and you probably should strongly consider whether you want to enable it. When that option is enabled, if somebody mistypes their PIN or their passcode 8 times, the device is going to automatically wipe itself. Now, that might be something you think is very useful. If a device is lost and someone's trying to break into the device, you'd want it to automatically detect that and wipe the device. But it's also the kind of thing that can happen when children are playing with their parents' smartphones and mobile devices and just bashing away at the numbers trying to unlock them. In that case, probably not going to be very happy that their device got wiped. So I'm going to leave that unchecked at this point, and I'm just going to enforce a simple password and also remove this option so that mobile devices must support the policies in order to synchronize. This default active sync or mobile device policy that is created by Setup is automatically applied to all mailboxes in the organization. So now that policy is in effect, and we can move on to what happens next in mobile device management. The next thing that happens to a mobile device that's connecting to Exchange is it goes through the allow block quarantine workflow. And this is what that allow block quarantine or ABQ workflow actually looks like. So starting from the left, the device tries to authenticate, and if it successfully authenticates, it will connect to the mailbox as long as the mailbox is active sync enabled. After that, as we saw, it looks for policy compliance. And if there's a problem with policy compliance, the device may go straight to a state of blocked. But if policy compliance passes, we move on to what's known as the personal exemptions. And the first thing that is checked is whether the device is blocked by any personal exemptions. If it is blocked, that's the end of the ABQ workflow. There's no other assessment done. If it is not blocked, then we move on to the next option, which is checking to see if it is allowed by personal exemption. If it is allowed by a personal exemption, the device is let through and none of the other ABQ criteria are checked. With a personal exemption, it either blocks or allows a specific device ID for a specific mailbox user. The device IDs are added to the block or allow list for a mailbox, either by an administrator choosing to block or allow a quarantine device. And quarantine is something we're going to look at in just a few moments, or by an administrator manually updating the block allow list for a mailbox by running the set cas mailbox commandlet. In order to do so, you would need to know the exact device ID of that device, which is usually available from within the mobile operating system, or sometimes it's even included as a sticker on the outside of the box. So assuming that a device is not blocked or allowed by personal exemption, the next thing we move on to in the ABQ process is the device access rules. First, any device access rules that block the device are checked. If one is found, then yes, the device is blocked and nothing else in that ABQ workflow is checked. Otherwise, we move on to checking for any rules that quarantine the device. That may put the device straight into a state of quarantine, but if there's no rules that are quarantining the device, it then moves on and checks to see if there are any rules that would allow that particular device. If there are, then the device goes straight to an allowed state, or if not, it moves on through the ABQ workflow to the next step. Device access rules are created by administrators in the Exchange Admin Center, or they can use PowerShell to do it. Device access rules are based on device characteristics, and there are 4 characteristics that you can use. The first is device type, which is also called family, device model, device OS or operating system, and also the user agent. Device access rules can apply either an allow, block, or quarantine action when they match a connecting device. There are a few caveats to be aware of when you're implementing device access rules. The first is that the rule characteristics are specific. There are no wildcards and there are no partial matches. When you configure a rule, it has to exactly match the criteria that you're assessing. Device access rules will apply organization-wide. You can't scope them or apply them just to a subset of your users, and you can't nominate any users to be exempt from device access rules. The only way to exempt someone from a device access rule is to add a personal exemption for their device, which is checked earlier in the ABQ workflow, which would therefore allow their device before the device access rules are even checked. And also the device characteristics that you configure your device access rules to check for can change, which might cause a device to change from an allowed to a blocked or quarantine state. Let's say, for example, if they were running an older operating system and they upgraded to a newer operating system that you'd chosen to block with a device access rule. And they may also upgrade their way out of a quarantine status back into an allowed status. But once a device has been blocked by a device access rule, it stays that way until the rule itself is removed. Device access rules can be quite challenging to implement. And here's a really good example of why. If you had an iPhone and you were using the native mail application on that iPhone, Exchange would see a device type of iPhone, a device model of iPhone 8C1, that's for an iPhone 6S, a device OS of iOS 9.2.1.13D15, and then a device user agent of Apple-iPhone 8C1/1304.15. So you might take the decision to block the iPhone 6S based on any one of those 4 characteristics. But then if the person who owns that device installs the Outlook app from Microsoft, connects to Exchange with it, well, this is how the Outlook app appears to Exchange. It's a device type of Outlook, a device model of Outlook for iOS and Android, a device OS of Outlook for iOS and Android 1.0, and a device user agent of Outlook-iOS-Android/1.0. So when you're blocking based on those iPhone 6S characteristics, the same rules are not going to block the Outlook app, even if the Outlook app is running on exactly the same device. So let's go into the Globomantics demo environment and have a look at configuring device access rules. From the Exchange Management Shell, we can run the get mobile device commandlet. And in this case, we just want to look at the friendly name of each device and also any attributes with the word device in them. So that returns two mobile devices. One is Outlook for iOS and Android, and the other is an iPhone 5S. Both of them have a device access state of allowed, and the device access state reason is global. And what global means is that the ABQ workflow got all the way to the end and it just used the default organization access state, which is something we're going to look at in a moment. And that defaults to allow. So basically any mobile device will be allowed to connect. So let's say Globomantics has taken a decision to quarantine any iPhones so that they can be reviewed by the IT department before they're allowed to connect. And one way to do that is to use the characteristic of device type, which in this case is iPhone. So we can create a new ActiveSync device access rule looking at the characteristic of device type, query string of iPhone, and an access level of quarantine. So that creates the device access rule for us. And let's have a look now at the effect that has on those connecting devices. Well, now the iPhone has switched to a device access state of quarantined. The reason is device rule, and it even tells us which rule is responsible for quarantining that device. Well, having looked at device access rules, the only stage left in the allow block quarantine process is the organization default access state. This default access state will apply to devices that have not been allowed, blocked, or quarantined by any of the previous ABQ steps. So we'll go back into the Globomantics environment and configure the organization default access level. In the Exchange Admin Center, just navigate again to the mobile section and this time look at mobile device access, and over to the side of the page is this edit button for editing the default organizational access level. The default setting is to allow, and you can also change that to block or to quarantine. If you do choose to quarantine, you can also add additional recipients who will receive a notification when a new mobile device is quarantined. That gives the opportunity to send notifications to perhaps a help desk or a security team who is responsible for reviewing those quarantined devices. You can also include additional text. When a device has been quarantined, a message is sent by Exchange to that mailbox advising them that the quarantine has occurred. And by including some additional text, you can perhaps avoid any confused phone calls to your support team or to your help desk. And you can include instructions in there such as directing them to go to an intranet page and fill out a request for their mobile device to be approved. So in this example, let's simply change the level to quarantine, which will mean any new devices will be quarantined. And it will also mean that any existing devices will be quarantined if their device access state reason was global. Any devices that are being allowed by a personal exemption or being allowed by a device access rule will not be affected by changing this to quarantine. Well, now that we've seen how to configure a device access rule and also how to configure the organization default access level to quarantine devices, we can actually now look at how to manage those quarantine devices. In this mobile device access view in the Exchange Admin Center, if we just refresh this list, we should see those quarantine devices for the user appear. So we've got both the iPhone, which has been quarantined by a device access rule, and also the Outlook application, which has been quarantined thanks to that default access level for the entire organization. From this list of quarantine devices, you can go ahead and either block or allow the quarantine device. You can also configure a device access rule using the Exchange Admin interface, basing it off that quarantine device's characteristics. In this case, let's go ahead and approve both of those devices. And now let's go back into PowerShell and have a look at the effect that that had on the mobile devices. You can see that they've both changed to a state of allowed, and this time the device access state reason is individual, which means they've been set as personal exemptions. We can see the personal exemptions for that mailbox by running the get cas mailbox commandlet. In the ActiveSync allowed device IDs attribute is the two device IDs representing those two mobile devices. So as long as those device IDs exist there in that ActiveSync allowed device IDs attribute for this one particular mailbox user, they will be allowed to connect, but only for this one particular user. Now, at some stage, you might decide that one of those devices should not be allowed to connect, and in fact, it should be blocked. Well, you can simply take that device ID value and add it to the ActiveSync blocked device IDs list. And since a block always takes precedence over an allow, that device will now switch to a blocked state instead of an allowed state. And we should see that if we review those mobile devices again. So now the iPhone is still allowed, but the Outlook for iOS and Android application is now blocked for this particular user. Now let's take a look at the rather sensitive topic of remote wipes for mobile devices. This is a question that you don't want to hear. Hey, where'd my baby photos go? And you definitely don't want to hear that from someone whose phone just got remote wiped. The thing you must remember about remote wipe is that it is destructive and it is irreversible. Now that may not be 100% correct. There might be some forensic method of recovering data from a remote wipe device, but from a layman's perspective, there's no way to get that data back. It has been wiped permanently. The entire device is wiped when you issue a remote wipe. It's not just the corporate information that is wiped, it is the entire device. But there are some exceptions. If they are using a mobile application instead of the native mail application on their iPhone or Android device, then the remote wipe is constrained to just that app data. And Outlook for iOS and Android is a good example of that. So the rest of the data on the phone will remain untouched. It's also important to remember that remote wipes are not guaranteed. Even if you issue a remote wipe request, it's not necessarily going to be successful. Devices that can't connect to Exchange will not see that remote wipe request, so they'll never actually perform that remote wipe. Now, the reasons that lost or stolen devices can't connect to Exchange are many. It's possible that the person who has the device has intentionally disabled Wi-Fi on the device, or perhaps the device has run out of battery because it's been left in the back of a taxi or the back of a seat pocket on an airplane, or perhaps when the device was reported stolen, the user's password was changed, which will stop their lost device from actually authenticating, therefore it won't be able to connect. So just remember that even if you do issue a remote wipe, it's not necessarily going to work. Who can remote wipe a device? Well, we've already seen that users can initiate their own mobile device wipes from within the Exchange control panel. Administrators can also initiate those remote device wipes from the Exchange Admin Center or from PowerShell. So let's go back into the Globomantix environment and we'll perform a remote wipe of a mobile device. To see the mobile device, we actually need to look at the properties of the mailbox. And just by selecting the mailbox from the recipients list and looking for mobile devices in the right-hand pane, you can just click on View Details there, and we should see both of the mobile devices that are associated with that user. So we have one application, Outlook for iOS and Android, that is currently access denied, and one device, which is the iPhone 5S, which is currently access granted. So to start with, we can highlight this Outlook application and just issue that wipe request right here. that wipe request goes into a pending state, and it will stay that way basically forever until that wipe has been successfully completed. So after a few moments, let's check back in and see how that remote wipe is going. Still at this stage, it's in a pending state. If you changed your mind, if the device had been found, you could cancel that remote wipe request. Now after a few minutes, we're still seeing that wipe in a pending state. But because I have the device in my hands, I know for a fact that the application has actually wiped all of its data. But why am I seeing that wipe pending status still there for the remote wipe? Why aren't we seeing a successful wipe? Well, the simple matter is that it's just a quirk in the nature of that Outlook for iOS and Android application. They actually connect through a cloud service. They don't connect directly to your Exchange servers. That means that when you issue the wipe, that wipe request is actually being proxied to the mobile device. So even though the mobile device or the Outlook application on the device has been wiped, the results of that wipe are not necessarily passed back immediately or at all to your on-premises Exchange server. So you would just see that wipe remaining in a pending state. If we want to see something a little bit more complete, well, we could do a remote wipe of the whole iPhone. Remote wipes can also be issued from PowerShell. In order to perform the remote wipe from PowerShell, we need to know the identity of the mobile device. So there are two devices there, and unfortunately the iPhone identity is being cut off. So let's see if we can get the full identity. So let's issue a clear mobile device command. And when we're issuing the clear mobile device command, we can also nominate a notification email address, which is going to receive the results of that remote wipe. So we'll just let the mailbox owner know in this case whether or not their mobile device wipe has been successful. We'll just say yes to that warning about all of the data on the mobile device being permanently deleted. Now that that command has been issued, let's go back and have a look at this user's mobile devices. And for the iPhone, we now actually see a status of remote device wipe successful. So that's good news. That Outlook application has stayed in a pending state. As I said, that's just a quirk with the way that particular service works. And going back to the user's client machine, let's have a look in Outlook and see if that remote wipe notification has actually arrived. And there we have it. There's good news. The remote device wipe was completed successfully. Well, that brings us to the end of this module on mobility, in which we looked at Outlook web app policies, which are used to enable or disable access to features of mailboxes when using Outlook on the web, and also mobile device management and how ActiveSync works and how we can manage devices and how we can manage the mobile devices for end users. Coming up in the next module, we're going to look at troubleshooting for client access.